My name is Renee Castillo. I'm 36 years old. I teach fifth grade in Phoenix, Arizona, and 11 days ago, I sat in a parking lot outside an oncology office and found out that the health insurance I had been faithfully paying my parents for every single month for 6 straight years had been canceled exactly 9 days earlier, the same week my biopsy results came back. I want to tell you the whole story slowly, properly, because the ending isn't what you'd expect, and it didn't come from me standing up for myself in some big dramatic way. It came from my aunt and one phone call she made that ended a lie my parents had been quietly living inside for a very long time. Before I get into it, if you've ever paid faithfully into something you assumed was solid ground, only to find out later it had already been pulled out from under you without a word of warning, this story is for you. Subscribe if that sounds familiar, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely love reading through all of them before bed. I should explain the insurance situation first, because it's a little unusual and every detail of it matters for what comes later. My father, Manuel, spent almost 30 years working for a mid-sized construction company in Tucson, and through a strange quirk of an old family business arrangement, our family had ended up on a small group health plan that my father had technically owned, since his own father ran an earlier version of the same company decades before either of us was born. When I turned 26 and aged off my own individual coverage, my parents offered to keep me on that family plan rather than have me shop for something separate, since in practice, splitting the group premium 3 ways was genuinely cheaper for everyone involved. I paid my share every single month, $410, straight into my mother Carla's account for 6 full years. Never late, never questioned. It felt honestly like one of the only steady, uncomplicated things my family and I did together as adults. I trusted it completely. Over 6 years, that adds up to just under $30,000 I paid directly into that family plan, money I never once thought to track closely, because why would you track something you trusted? I should also tell you a little about my sister Vanessa, because the shape of everything that happened only makes sense once you understand her, and understand the specific role she'd occupied in our family since we were children. Vanessa is 33, 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, she has been what my mother calls, in that particular tone mothers use, the one who needs a little extra support. Growing up, that meant Vanessa got the later curfew, the benefit of the doubt, the extra right to practice. As adults, it meant Vanessa got the extra financial cushion over and over, dressed up in different justifications each time. 2 years earlier, Vanessa had started a small event planning business, funded partly by her parents, and it had been struggling for most of that time, bleeding a little more money every quarter, the kind of slow leak that never quite becomes a crisis you can point to directly until suddenly it does. 3 weeks before all of this started, I found a lump during a routine self-exam and went in for a mammogram, which led to a biopsy, which led to the appointment 11 days ago where a doctor sat across from me and used the words early stage and very treatable in the same sentence as we'd like to start treatment as soon as possible. I remember feeling almost strangely calm hearing it because I had good insurance, a good doctor, and what I believed at the time was a solid plan. I walked out to my car in that parking lot, sat down, and called the billing office to confirm my next appointment's coverage, purely as a formality, the kind of call you make without really thinking about it. The woman on the phone paused for a long, uncomfortable moment before she spoke. "I'm showing your coverage was terminated on the 1st of this month," she said. "Would you like me to transfer you to someone who can go over self-pay options?" I sat in that parking lot for what felt like a very long time, staring at the dashboard, doing the math in my head over and over. The diagnosis came back on the 4th. My coverage had ended on the 1st, 3 days before. I called my mother immediately, and she picked up on the fourth ring, sounding distracted, the way she often does when she's already decided a conversation is going to be inconvenient. Mom, my insurance says it was canceled. What happened? There was a pause, and then she said, in a tone I can only describe as rehearsed, "Oh, honey, we had to make some changes to the plan. Costs went up. We'll sort it out." I asked her plainly if this had anything to do with my diagnosis, since the timing seemed genuinely impossible to ignore. She told me not to be dramatic, that these things happen with small group plans all the time, and that she had to go because she was picking up my sister Vanessa from the airport. I want to pause here because that specific detail, my sister being picked up from the airport, turned out to matter far more than I understood in that first moment. Stay with me because it's about to click into place the same way it clicked for me about 40 minutes later. Vanessa had flown out that particular week, I would learn, to meet with our parents in person about what she was calling restructuring the business, a phrase I would come to understand very differently within the hour. I called my father directly because something about my mother's answer hadn't sat right with me at all. He answered on speaker, and I could hear my mother's voice in the background before he even said hello, telling him something I couldn't quite make out. "Dad, why was my insurance canceled the same week I got diagnosed with cancer?" There was a long silence, long enough that I said his name twice before he spoke. "Renee, it's not what it sounds like. We had to free up some funds this month. Vanessa's business needed a cash injection, and the group plan premium was the easiest thing to cut. We didn't know about your diagnosis when we made the decision." I asked him, since he'd brought up timing himself, exactly what day they had actually made that decision. He didn't answer that question. My mother took the phone from him at that point, and her voice shifted into something colder, more defensive than I'd heard from her in a long time. "Renee, we can't keep bankrolling everyone's problems forever. You have a job. You have savings." Vanessa needed this more than the insurance did right now. I sat there in that parking lot, still wearing my hospital visitor badge from the biopsy follow-up, and asked the only question I actually wanted answered. "Did you cancel my coverage to fund Vanessa's business, knowing I might need it?" My mother's answer was simply, "We didn't think it would be a big deal." And then she hung up. If you're a parent yourself, or if you've ever paid faithfully into something you trusted completely, I want you to sit with that answer for a second, the way I had to sit with it, alone in that parking lot. We didn't think it would be a big deal. That wasn't an apology, and it wasn't even really a denial. It was simply a statement that my life in that particular week hadn't registered as important enough to check on before making a decision that could directly affect my cancer treatment. I didn't call anyone else that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and did what I do best as a teacher who spends her entire professional life organizing chaos into manageable lesson plans. I made a list. What coverage had I actually lost? What would self-pay treatment realistically cost? What options did I have? I found an emergency financial assistance program through the hospital, a possible bridge policy through the state marketplace, and a direct number for patient financial services that I plan to call first thing in the morning. I want you to know that I handled that entire first night completely on my own, calmly, methodically, the way I handle everything, because that is exactly the kind of daughter my parents had built their whole plan around without ever having to say it out loud. The one who manages. The one who doesn't make it a big deal either. It was my Aunt Roberta, my mother's older sister, who changed absolutely everything, and she did it without my even asking her to, without my even knowing it was happening until it was already done. Roberta had called me the very next morning, completely unrelated to any of this, just checking in on me the way she does every couple of weeks, a habit she'd kept up faithfully since I was a kid. I told her honestly because I was simply too tired to hide it or soften it, exactly what had happened. There was a long silence on the line, and then Roberta said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Renee, this isn't the first time your mother has moved money around Vanessa's business using things that weren't hers to move. I asked her what she meant. Roberta told me that 2 years earlier, right when Vanessa's business first launched, our parents had taken out a small home equity loan against a rental property that had actually been left jointly to both me and Vanessa by our grandfather, using paperwork that listed only Vanessa as the sole owner. Roberta had discovered this entirely by accident through the property tax records, while helping settle some final details of our grandfather's estate, and had confronted my mother privately about it at the time, only to be told, in no uncertain terms, to stay out of it, that it was a family matter and not Roberta's business. I let it go then, Roberta said, because it was your money, not mine. And you seemed happy and genuinely didn't know, and I didn't want to be the one to blow up your relationship with your mother over property paperwork you weren't even aware existed. But canceling your insurance while you're sitting in an oncology office is a different kind of thing entirely. Renee, that's not overstepping a boundary anymore. That's a pattern, and patterns don't stop on their own. Here's what happened next, and I want to be completely honest with you that I did not orchestrate any of this part. Roberta did it entirely on her own, that same afternoon, without telling me first, without asking my permission, simply because she had decided quietly that she was done watching this particular pattern repeat. She called the family plan's insurance broker directly, a man named Dennis Ruiz, who had personally handled the plan for over a decade and knew our family well, and asked him plainly whether a policyholder could remove a dependent's coverage without any notice period whatsoever, especially a dependent who had been actively and independently paying into the plan herself for years. Dennis explained that under the plan's actual written terms, a full 30-day written notice was legally required before any dependent could be dropped, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of situation, an unexpected lapse in coverage during active or urgent treatment. My parents had provided no such notice. They had simply called and had me removed effective immediately, which technically violated the plan's own binding policy. Roberta then did something I still find remarkable every time I think about it. She asked Dennis, since he had handled the account personally for years and clearly took real pride in doing things properly, whether he'd be willing to reinstate my coverage retroactively, citing the improper notice as clear cause, while the broader family dispute got sorted out separately on its own timeline. Dennis agreed almost immediately, telling her it was, in his own words, the only decision that actually follows the contract, regardless of whatever's going on inside the family. I found out my coverage had been reinstated before I even found out Roberta had made the call at all. I got an automated email from the insurance portal that same afternoon confirming my active status, backdated to before the lapse, and I sat at my kitchen table and cried for the first time since the diagnosis. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of the strange, specific relief of watching something get quietly fixed by someone who simply refused to let it stay broken. If you're still with me, I want to ask you something, because I've thought about this a lot in the 11 days since. Do you have a Roberta in your own life? Someone who steps in and does the thing you're too exhausted or too polite or too conditioned to do yourself? Tell me about them in the comments, because I genuinely believe we don't say thank you to people like that nearly often enough while they're still here to hear it. Roberta wasn't finished though, not by a long way. That same evening, she called my mother directly and later told me almost the entire conversation, word for word, because she said she wanted me to hear it in her own voice rather than some soft and secondhand version. Carla, I spoke to Dennis today, Roberta said. Renee's coverage is reinstated. I also asked him a few general questions about how these family plans typically work, since I remembered you'd once mentioned the rental property loan used Vanessa's name only. I think it might be worth being very careful about how you explain any of this if Renee ever decides to have a lawyer look at that trust properly. My mother, according to Roberta, went completely silent on the phone for the first time in either of their entire lives together. I'm not trying to start a war with you, Carla, Roberta continued. I'm telling you, sister to sister, that you cannot keep treating your two daughters like interchangeable accounts you move funds between depending on who happens to be struggling that particular month. Renee has cancer. That is not a line item you get to cut when the budget feels tight. My mother's only response, Roberta told me afterward, was, "You don't understand the pressure I'm under trying to keep this whole family afloat." Roberta's answer to that, word for word, still gives me chills a little every time I repeat it. The pressure you created by using one daughter's safety net to patch another daughter's business isn't pressure, Carla. It's a choice. And you're going to have to explain that choice to Renee yourself, because I already told her everything about that rental property, and I am done carrying that secret for you. I want to tell you honestly that my mother never called me that night to explain anything at all. It took 4 more days before my father finally called alone, his voice quieter than I had ever once heard it in my entire life. He told me the insurance decision had genuinely, truly been my mother's idea, made quickly without much real thought, in the middle of trying to help Vanessa avoid losing her business lease entirely. He said he hadn't fully realized, until Roberta's call forced the pattern into the light, how many times over the years small decisions like that one had quietly, consistently favored Vanessa at my direct expense, starting with that rental property 2 full years earlier. I should have asked more questions, he told me, and I could hear, for the first time, something that sounded like genuine shame in his voice about all of it. Not just this week. I wanted to tell you about a few other calls that came in during those same 11 days, because I think the wider picture matters here too, not just the 4 of us. My coworker, Denise, who I'd mentioned the diagnosis to only briefly in the staff lounge, brought me a casserole one evening, completely unprompted, Emma explained. In a moment of exhaustion, what had happened with the insurance, she just looked at me and said, "Renee, that's not normal. I need you to hear that from someone outside your family." A parent of one of my students who happens to work in healthcare administration offered on her own initiative to help me navigate the marketplace bridge policy paperwork if the family situation didn't resolve in time. I didn't ask for any of this help. It simply arrived quietly from people who had no obligation to give it, which somehow made it land even harder than it otherwise would have. I didn't get a grand confrontation scene the way some of these stories go, the big dramatic dinner table reveal. I got a quiet, halting acknowledgement from my father, and continued distance from my mother, who to this day maintains that she was simply trying to help everyone, and that I'm choosing to see the whole situation in the worst possible light. I stopped trying to convince her otherwise. Some people will never see the actual shape of what they did until someone else holds up the paperwork directly in front of them, and even then, some people will still find a way to look away from it. Here's where things stand now, 3 months later, as I sit here telling you all of this. My treatment started exactly on schedule, fully covered, entirely because Roberta refused to let a single phone call go unmade. The rental property matter is now formally with a lawyer, not out of spite on my part, but because Vanessa herself, once she learned the full truth of how her business had actually been funded all along, insisted on it being corrected properly, splitting the property's actual value fairly between us the way our grandfather had genuinely intended from the beginning. Vanessa and I are surprisingly closer now than we've been in years, because it turns out she was never really the villain in any of this. She simply never knew whose safety net she'd been quietly standing on the whole time. My mother and I speak occasionally now, carefully, the way you speak to someone you love, but no longer fully trust with anything that actually matters. My father calls more often now, entirely on his own initiative, usually just to check in, no hidden agenda attached to it anymore. And Roberta, my aunt who made one phone call she absolutely did not have to make, is the person I call first now for almost anything. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. The people who love you the most sometimes aren't the ones who raised you. Sometimes they're simply the ones who refuse to let something wrong stay quiet, even when it was never technically their fight to pick in the first place. If this reminded you of your own Roberta, or if you needed to hear tonight that someone can step in and fix what feels completely unfixable, please share this with them. Tell me in the comments, would you have made that call yourself the way Roberta did, or would you have waited to be asked first? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because I have a lot more to tell you. I'll see you in the next one.